Namaskar and welcome to this special panel discussion on growth and resilience of the Indian economy. We are discussing this in the light of the G20 summit that's going to happen on the 9th and 10th of this month. And we're looking at the Indian economy, which is an economy that's on a high growth path, an economy that has a trajectory that seems to have astonished the world. What are the reasons for this momentum within the Indian economy, while the rest of the world seems to be facing a little bit of turbulence? What is it that has kept this momentum going, whether it's the policies of the government, what is the ecosystem, the business environment, and all this we will be discussing with an eminent panel. Let me introduce you to them. Mr. Ajay Seth is Secretary of the Department of Economic Affairs in the Ministry of Finance. Mr. V. Anantha Nageshwaran is the Chief Economic Advisor of the Finance Ministry. And Subrakant Panda is the President of the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry. Sachin Chaturvedi is the Director General of Research and Information Systems for Developing Countries, a well-known economist. And Mr. J.S. Mukul is former Ambassador of India, former senior diplomat, currently a professor teaching international relations at Sushant University. Thank you all for being with us. Let me start by asking you, Mr. Seth, so why is India standing out? If you have to look at three reasons why India is standing out at this current time, while the rest of the world seems to be facing some turbulence.
India growing at a very good pace, among the fastest growing economy last year and even continuing that momentum this year. Three reasons. I'll put it, number one, macroeconomic stability, be it for fiscal prudence and continuously being committed and delivering on the fiscal prudence path. Good price stability as compared with most other countries. Third one is sound external sector, including a reasonable exchange rate. The second reason I'll put it here would be an ample opportunities for the business and investment, including those in infrastructure, whether it is in the area of, say, the digital economy or, say, through the productivity-linked incentives. And the third area, I'll put it, the way government has gone ahead with the pace of reforms. The pace of reforms, including to the pandemic, were stepped up. And that has opened up ample space and ample opportunities for productivity gains. So there is a positive sentiment that not only the current investments, but even the future, more investments would be possible in the economy.
Indeed, let me turn to industry representative and ask him very clearly whether the business environment is conducive. Is it really the ease of doing business? Is the ecosystem really that good? Is it in place? Tell us a little bit about it.
Absolutely. And if I can just add something to what Mr. Seth said, I think if you look at where we stand today, it's a factor of a large unified domestic market, thanks to GST reforms, favorable demographics, and of course, if you look at it from a point of view of sustained reforms born out of conviction, which is how the Honorable Prime Minister puts it. So if I were to use that to segue onto the question you asked, very clearly there is a marked improvement in the ease of doing business as far as industry is concerned. And I can vouch for the fact that right through the pandemic, there was a tremendous outreach from the government to all of us, to industry associations, to come back with suggestions on how ease of doing business could be improved. And what was very clear that it was, the crisis was looked as an opportunity to bring about lasting change, and I think that is what is evident in terms of where we stand today. So whether it is the Jan Vishwas bill, which decriminalizes a lot of mundane issues which were earlier punishable with jail sentences or whatever it is, so that measures like that inspire confidence, and a lot of rules and regulations which were not really relevant in a modern world, I think have been addressed. So from that point of view, I would certainly say that ease of doing business is markedly improved, and that is what is giving confidence to industry today to look at investing, and of course that is also helped by the heavy lifting that the government has done in terms of the remarkable outlay on infrastructure, which is helping crowd in private expenditure.
Let me turn to Dr. Nageshwaran. Talking about that infrastructure, we know that technology is a great enabler. It's also a great disruptor. How has, the Digital India platform laid the foundation, in a sense, for a new India?
See, the digital public infrastructure, which we have ramped up very steadily over the last 6 to 8 years, is helping the Indian economy not only achieve efficiencies, but also in lifting the potential growth rate, at least by about 50 basis points per annum. Of course, more rigorous estimates have to be done. It helps in the following three ways. One is financial inclusion and formalization of the economy. Many small, medium, and micro players who were outside the formal economy are now able to use their financial transactions, etc., to become part of the formal economy. And third, even for the most tiniest enterprise, being part of the government's procurement network or in the open network, digital commerce, etc., it gives them access to a much larger market, both nationally and internationally. So three dimensions in which the digital public infrastructure that India has put in place and is still evolving is helping our financial inclusion, formalization, improved market access, and all three combined to improve the productive potential of the economy and lifting the potential growth rate by at least 50 basis points per annum.
Dr. Chaturvedi, is there a concern? I mean, is there still a divide, a digital divide between the rural and parts of India and the rest of India, the urban India? Is there that concept still exists, or despite the digital public infrastructure that Dr. Nageshwaran has talked about?
Mark, if you see the demand boost that is now discernible, you would see a huge extent is already covered. You would find more and more Jan Dhan account, more and more Mudra accounts are coming from rural areas. You would see this happening in terms of financial inclusion indicators. You would see this in terms of access to several of the financial services that are being offered. More demand is coming from rural areas, and you see this across the states. The efforts to bridge the connectivity gaps that are there, digital connectivity, that has already been extended. But as we are discussing the G20 presidency, India's endeavor is to see how G20 can bring on table issues where we can address this gap for the global south. How do we bring in unbanked 430 million people who are unbanked across the G20? How do we bring them in? So it's not just about rural areas in India, but in the larger context, as throughout last 8 or 10 months, we have been talking in terms of bringing global south on board and trying to see how digital divide across the globe can be addressed. And India's endeavors, as Dr. Nageshwaran mentioned, is largely to bridge that gap for everybody. And that, I think, is a larger endeavor in terms of what Prime Minister has been saying in terms of bringing everyone on the same page for development. And this, I think, has given a positive fillip in terms of how the development gaps are adequately being addressed. And that, I think, is a solidarity on development-related issues that Indian G20 presidency stands for.
Mr. Seth, if we talk about the Jan Dhan accounts, I mean, it's truly revolutionary, the number of accounts that exist. And, the whole idea also about banking sector reforms. How has this financial inclusion led to formalization of the economy, increased the market size, and to what extent can this be replicated, at least in the global south?
A couple of thoughts here. One, that we have closed about 50 crore Jan Dhan accounts, and the last numbers of, say, June end, they were close to about 4,700 rupees per account. That's the average balances were there. And an active transactions are happening there. It's not just about the banking services, including the bank credit, but also on the insurance product. Just about a couple of days back, I and Professor Chaturvedi, we were in Madhya Pradesh, and anecdotal, just making an inquiries on the ground, even at a tehsil level, 3 out of 5 shops will have a QR code based payments. So that is kind of a penetration which has happened. It's no longer about big cities where the UPI payments are being done, and creates huge amount of opportunities for doing the business in a much efficient manner. Moving further, it does help government when the direct benefit transfers are etc. are being done, but where it helps others. Now today, several states are now in a position to use this platform or the financial inclusion and the digital public infrastructure to apply it in the field of agriculture. That how a farmer, based on the land records which are already computerized, can approach a bank and ask for a crop loan, or for that matter, linking it with a dairy farmer based on the milk poured in a dairy cooperative at the village level. Based on that data, how that farmer can approach a bank and get in few, not in few days, but in a question of in a matter of about 10 minutes or so, entire operation being a rule-based operation, and that can be provided for. And I'll add one more element, rather two more elements here. The way GST has been implemented, and from 2017 onwards, use of e-way bill. There are no more check posts anywhere. E-invoices. Now it is for any business which is doing a turnover of 5 crore and above, they are using e-invoices. That helps hugely in the formalization of the economy. Further to say, there is not just one element. At the same time, getting two elements. One, on the registration of the MSMEs and providing some of the services which are government to MSME, business to business MSME services through that portal. And then going into the e-Shram portal, wherein those who are working in those MSMEs can also get onto the platform and get their skill upgradation services. The last one, you mentioned it about banking sector reforms. Yes, with one of the very low level of NPAs and a very strong balance sheet of the banks, they are in a much stronger position to provide credit anybody or any business which is in need of credit.
Dr. Nageshwaran, if we look at CAPEX, heavy spending on infrastructure, how has it really helped the supply side?
Yeah.
We talked about the foundation for a new India with the digital. What about the real infrastructure and the foundation for our economy?
That's right. So your first question actually helped me address the first pillar of India's future growth. The second pillar is the capital expenditure that the government has undertaken over the last several years. I think it was a very well thought through form of fiscal intervention, not only for the COVID purposes, but also from the long-term point of view. Because the multiplier effect of governments putting one rupee of capital expenditure is far more in terms of output creation and employment generation than 1 rupee of direct handouts given to people. And secondly, government consciously undertook capital expenditure at a time when both the banking sector balance sheets and private sector balance sheets were under repair. And banks were reluctant to lend to the private sector because of the history of bad debt that happened earlier in the last decade. So the only credit-worthy borrower was the government. And therefore, it was appropriate that the government undertook on itself the responsibility to drive the economic growth forward with capital expenditure. Now, what it has done is not only to allow private sector to take time to repair its balance sheet and now come forward and invest on its own, which is beginning to happen, but more than that, this supply side investments has shown up in the fact that India's inflation excess last year was much lower compared to many other countries which had a much larger inflation overshoot. And therefore, the Reserve Bank of India was able to hike interest rates only by 250 basis points compared to how much it took for many other countries to even now combating to bring down their inflation rate. So the supply side investments, which India's capital expenditure signified, is actually raising the productive potential, as I mentioned earlier, but is also helping us to prolong the economic cycle than before. That is the contribution that government's emphasis on capital expenditure has led to.
Now, if we come back to the G20 and the Global South, Ambassador Mukul, how well placed is India, to drive this development agenda for the Global South? We are saying that we are the voice of the Global South.
Thank you. First of all, delighted to be here. Now, to understand actually India's position with regard to the Global South, we need to take a step back to the 1970s and the 80s. When India was trying to engage through not India as a country, but through our developing country fora like the G77 or the G15, trying to engage the developed countries at that time represented by the G7 and later the G8. The results were very unsatisfactory. I would say they were mixed results. We did not get satisfaction. Why do I say that? Very often, the communique coming from these developing country organizations would hardly be acknowledged. Sometimes you would have side meetings when there was a G7, G8 summit. Of course, the agenda at that time was set by them. It took the crisis, the Asian financial crisis first of 1999, for the G20, for the G7, G8 to realize the need to have a larger grouping of emerging markets and developing countries, the EMDCs as we call them. And then, of course, the Great Recession or the international financial and economic crisis of 2008, when this G20 from the finance minister, central bank governors level was raised to the summit level. So that is the background in which we have to understand. And it is important for countries like India, which became part of the G20 in 2008 at the summit level. Incidentally, that was the first time in history that some of us, the developing countries, got a place on the high table as equals with the developed countries. Now, that is the first point. That is the background. Now, having said that, it is important for countries like ours not to forget our other partners in the global south or in the G77 or what have you. And I think it is in that context that India has done extremely well by taking on board the interest. As you know, the Honorable Prime Minister convened the virtual summit of the Global South, and actually the ideas that have been taken on board permeate all the other priorities of the Indian presidency. So in a manner of speaking, the spirit of the Global South runs through the Indian priorities in our presidency.
Okay.
Now, that is where we were, and that is where we have done well. But what also I think is important is that we have not just forgotten, we have just not forgotten the Global South, but we have also taken this forward. If you take the proposal of India for involving, say, the African Union to be a permanent member, I think it will be, as I read in the newspapers, there appears to be an emerging consensus on the African Union. It will be the first expansion of the G20 in 24 years. It will be a very good symbolic thing for India's presidency and a result coming out of the Delhi summit. It also, I think, sits very well with our theme of the G20, that is Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and resonates brilliantly with the priority of the Global South. So that is where we are. The last point I'll make on this is that I hope that when the results of the summit come out, we will have been able to persuade, we as in the Global South or the developing and emerging market countries in the G20 would have been able to persuade the developed countries to put their money where their mouth is. Frankly, we don't need the G20 or the developed to tell us what we need. We are quite capable of doing that is the Global South for ourselves. But what they need to do is to meet their commitments. For example, just two small quick examples. On the climate change, they are supposed to be paying $100 billion per year since 2020. They have not been meeting their commitment. There is a commitment going back to the 1970s and 80s, where the developed countries are supposed to provide 0.7% of their GDP or GNI as official development assistance.
Yes.
I don't think most of them are meeting. So really they have to meet their commitments. Otherwise, you see, while we have done well, the Global South will have done well in putting forward all our agenda items, what is required for the Global South. I'm sure they'll come out in the communique or the outcome document. Sure. But I think we really need the developed countries to meet their commitments.
Dr. Chaturvedi, there clearly seems to be a shifting power dynamic here. The Global South has definitely the population advantage. The resources are being developed also over time. And how effective is this? We're talking about India's demographic dividend. How effective is this in helping India's presidency take across this message that Ambassador Mukul was talking right now? actually, whether the North really needs to dictate terms in any way.
Mark, it is interesting, and I think it is interesting in several different ways. At RIS, we analyze the broad evolution that we see in economy for last 40 years. And if you look at the declining share of G7, be that in gross capital formation at the global level, be that in terms of active population. So I was just seeing some statistics. Global GDP share, if I go back to 1961 for G7 countries, it was almost 78%. And now in 2022, it has declined to 42%. And this is at constant prices. In current prices, it has declined further down. So if you look at in terms of their share, both in terms of employment generation, ability to contribute in terms of the growth. In fact, IMF report very clearly shows that 23-24 emerging markets would contribute almost 80% to the global growth. So if that's the share, due weightage has to be given. But then I think Global South also has the responsibility to take everyone along. India's G20 presidency is a remarkable opportunity for us, and under Prime Minister's leadership, we are trying to be a responsible emerging market. It is important for us to see that everyone comes along. We do not repeat the mistakes that have been done with multilateralism. And I must congratulate our team is here from finance track for bringing very strongly out this idea of a sustainable, strong, balanced and inclusive growth. So that I think is something where lots of messages, Mark, are important for us so that our countries of the Global South, they remain together. They ensure that it makes really inclusive with Africa on table. But at the same time, we would also have to see that it is not anti-G7.
Okay.
And that's where the idea of triangular cooperation that Prime Minister has been talking about is extremely important. We need to take West and East, North and South all together. And that's where those who are unbanked, those who are, as you asked previously, those who are out of digital revolution, those who are out of global value chains, they all are becoming part of it. But that also brings in responsibility on Global South to see that we do not create fractions within G20, which as Ambassador Mukul very eloquently articulated right from the Asian financial crisis to the transatlantic financial crisis. I don't call it global crisis, transatlantic crisis. We have seen this evolution, and that's where I think it is pertinent for us to see that we take everyone along there.
Ambassador Mukul, given that all the news about the Global South is not good, we know what's happening in Africa. There's military coup after another. Who knows, what the African leaders probably are thinking that maybe who's next, things like that. Also, there's a debt crisis in several countries of the Global South. So when we look at economic stability, how important is political stability for economic stability? And, you could throw some ideas about that within the Global South.
No, obviously, the Global South, and as Dr. Sachin Chaturvedi says, nobody can argue with that we have to set our house in order globally. And there, of course, the political stability is a prerequisite for, obviously, economic development. I think that is well accepted. The point which I was making was, yes, the Global South has to do, and we have to do not just individually, but also through South-South cooperation, which has been which has been going on for many decades and years. The short point which I was making was that we should also, because we are talking in the context of the G20, wherein you have both the South and the North. So that in that context, I was trying to say that the North should also make its contribution, and nobody is asking for charity, because that's not forthcoming. But this is only with regard to the commitments that they have made and have not been able to fulfill so far. That was the short point which I was making.
Dr. Chaturvedi, how effective has the G20 been in, providing stability to the member countries? I mean, after all, these are reasonably large economies, so there is a level of economic stability there. But, in case, after all, the world is going through some conflict right now, as we can see, how does this issue of stability, the two kinds of stability, political and economic stability, would that be part of should it be part of the agenda in a sense that the G20 should be looking at?
I think as Mr. Seth would elaborate further, but I think 2 points, Mark, are important. One is in terms of to what extent the G20 members are contributing in terms of creating disability. And there I think the global indebtedness that we find in case of Global South, particularly in African countries, and not to recognize it, not to discuss it, not to allow that to come in our documents, I think is something where the irresponsibility, in my view, comes in. And I think that's where Global South would have to be extremely responsible, that we create a space for economic growth of everyone. If we make countries completely indebted, do not allow economy to grow, create infrastructure projects in such a way that this indebtedness multiplies many times, we do not enable multilateral institutions to work.
Traditional medicine is widely used and increasingly relevant in the world today. Yet, it has been around for millennia. At a time when we were more in balance with our environment and in harmony with nature, we began looking into its healing powers to cure our aches and pains and discover our own remedies. Our understanding of traditional practices began to grow. Now over 80% of the world's population use traditional medicine. It's also the foundation for many modern medicines and practices. Some 40% of the approved pharmaceutical products in use today come from natural substances like tree barks and plant roots. So why don't national health strategies fully take all this into account? To answer these and other questions, we welcome the World Health Organization's new Global Center for Traditional Medicine. A bold new vision.
Do not allow capitalization of our multilateral development banks, oppose them, bring in ideas more on whether it is sustainable growth strategy, sustainable development strategy, and then get lost in that quagmire. I think it is important, Mark, for us to realize that countries require space for economic development. They require resources for economic development. India has demonstrated, and thanks to, again, Finance Ministry's leadership, each budget we have spent more money, as CA was mentioning, in terms of local resources for capital formation. This is a growth strategy that is relevant for them, and that's what is going to bring in stability. And I think the G20 platform is more to facilitate that. This responsible approach is important, and I think expected from all the key members of the G20.
If we come back to India, Mr. Panda, and look at our own economy, manufacturing, it accounts for about 17 to 18% of GDP currently. Is the ecosystem conducive to push this up to, let's say, 25%? Is industry, willing to push it further?
So, you've asked a very important question, because when we harbor ambitions of being a $5 trillion economy, and in fact beyond, manufacturing has to play a very important role. And what we have seen over the decades is that despite best efforts, manufacturing has, as a percentage of GDP, has remained around 17, 18%. Whereas agriculture is of a sort of a similar level and accounts for nearly half of employment, and that is simply not tenable. That is where manufacturing needs to step up. And I think this government has done a lot in terms of trying to give a boost to manufacturing, not least with the Production-Linked Incentive Scheme, or PLI, which is, as you know, covers 14 sectors, close to 2 trillion rupees in terms of an outlay, aimed at creating manufacturing champions with global scale. But having said that, I think the PLI scheme cannot be the panacea for everything that needs to be done to get the ecosystem to get going. And that's where a whole lot of other initiatives which have been taken, whether it is the national logistics policy to bring down the cost of logistics to global standards by 2030, whether it is the PM Gati Shakti National Master Plan, which is, it's simple thinking, but it wasn't being done before. Because you would have ports, but the road would not be ready. Then you'd have the roads, and then you would dig it up to lay wires or something of that sort. But today, in fact, the Gati Shakti scheme has been taken to the level where I believe there are something like 1,600 different data points which are being mapped, and that's just going to make the capital expenditure much more productive, and the assets which are created ready to go from the very beginning. And so, yes, I do agree that a lot is being done for manufacturing. Now, the question has been asked, why is it and when is it that private capex will come in? I think it's fair to keep in mind that while the COVID era is over, so to say, but obviously, private sector was waiting for that level of confidence to start investing, and that is where the significant capital expenditure made by the government, which I mentioned earlier, which is helping crowding in. But if I look at the FICCI manufacturing survey, which we do every quarter, that is clearly indicating average capacity utilization inching up from let's say the mid 60s to now about 76% on average, and that is around the stage where you start seeing capital expenditure. Of course, when you talk about 75% capacity utilization on average, what it includes is certain sectors which are at 80 to 90%, and that's where, whether it's auto components, etc., you are seeing investments. There are certain sectors which are a little lagging behind, and that excess capacity needs to be taken up before investment flows in. But generally, I think the investment announcements by the private sector, we have been seeing a steady upward movement, and I have no hesitation in saying that I think we have reached that inflection point where helped by conducive policies, helped by government expenditure which is happening, that you are seeing private capex step up to the plate, and you will see the effect of that in the several quarters ahead.
Mr. Seth, FDI coming in is around $80 billion every year on an average, and it's the highest that we are having, about $83 billion. How much will this increase going forward? Because we are talking about being the third largest economy in the world, and after all, this is a century in which India and China are going to be the largest economies of the world over time.
Okay, let me answer that question in different ways. Your last statement saying that China and India are going to be the largest economies. Financial year 21-22, India attracted about $80 billion plus, $84 billion. Next year, 22-23, it went down to $71 billion for good reason. Global flows on FDIs itself went down about $15 billion. This year, the first quarter numbers again are showing that $70 billion plus we should be achieving this year. These are the gross FDI numbers, but it's not surprising, because most of the advanced economies which have the surplus capital, they have been battling with inflation, and most of the central banks are tightening the monetary policies. With the high policy rates and domestic opportunities for higher returns being available to them purely from a debt instruments itself, the global FDI flows have come down. These are the strong headwinds are happening. Okay. So in that context, numbers dipping a little bit is not unusual. But if you look at the overall numbers, that in 13-14, India attracted about $35 billion. It took about 8 years. In 8 years, this doubled. Now, moving forward, I see the doubling number from 80 to doubling would take a much lesser period of time. That is a broad direction I can share. Why am that optimistic about those numbers? Because of, again, the reforms, the kind of efforts which have come, looking at ease of doing business, looking at very closely on cost of doing business, Government of India's policies around the productivity-linked incentives, and what Mr. Panda said, very high asset utilization in several sectors which are there. They are ripe for further investments happening. Mm-hmm. Not only those aspects, two more elements there, that India's strong push to phase in renewables that is opening up very large opportunities for FDI. And not just in terms of investments in greenfield projects, but even for the equipment which would be needed for greenfield projects. And the last piece I will put it, why I'm very optimistic about it, that now India has built a very significant amount of infrastructure, and operating assets are now ready to be monetized through the routes of InvIT and the REIT. So this provides that not only the opportunities are there, but those structures also have been, those instruments also have been put in place.
Dr. Nageshwar, and if we look at India and China becoming the largest economies in the world as is projected by economists, does this already shift the economic balance towards Asia, or is that something down the road? Is it already happening, and is it something that we are seeing in terms of growth rates improving in Asia and India acting as an engine in a sense?
So, in terms of the contribution that India will be making to global GDP growth, going for not only in FY24 but also in the coming years, it's going to be increasing. So, for example, based on the IMF projections for how the global GDP will expand in nominal terms this year, I think India will be contributing 1/6 of that. It was a fraction of that before. So, and this contribution will only keep increasing. The India's proportion of India's contribution proportion to global GDP growth, because as India's base increases, then the contribution will also go up. At the same time, China, for example, has been that kind of a locomotive for global growth for the last 20, 30 years, but obviously it has reached a particular size and its contribution, therefore, in relative terms will be ebbing. And plus, they also have demographic headwinds, etc., whereas India continues with its demographic advantage until the middle of the century. So therefore, one can reasonably expect India's share of global GDP and India's share of global GDP growth to continue to rise in the years ahead.
Mr. Panda, India does around $265 billion of trade every quarter. I mean, that's the latest figures I've looked at on the Commerce Ministry site for April to June, I think. So that's about 77%. This is with the top 25 trading partners of India. That's about 77% of all our trade. How diversified can it actually get? Because I'm talking only about the top 25 countries. We are doing $265 billion of trade every quarter.
So look, I mean, I think it's not just a large domestic market which will drive India's growth going ahead, but clearly the export markets as well, both in manufacturing as well as in services, or goods and services rather, I should say. From that point of view, I think what we are looking at in terms of engaging with the world through FTAs is a very important measure, because when we talk about China Plus One opportunity, we are talking about attracting investments into India, not just to cater to the domestic market, but also, as I said, to use India as a production base to cater to the world. And from that point of view, I think the confidence of the government and the confidence of industry to engage in FTAs and engage with the world through FTAs, I think will not just boost our trade going ahead, but also help diversify it. And in that context, I would say that, from an Indian industry perspective, we are confident today, we're competitive thanks to the conducive policies and the investments which are taking place. And all that Indian industry expects is a level playing field, and we are good to go on that front. I would also like to add a little bit I couldn't help comment on your previous question about India's contribution to growth. Look at it from this perspective. Today, we are a $3.5 trillion economy, or there and thereabouts. The first trillion took about 60 years, the next about 14 years, the third about 7 years, and going ahead, we are likely to add $1 trillion in growth roughly every 2 years or so. So that's where I think it's absolutely obvious that India is the next engine of growth. That's not to pull down anybody else, but to say that we are holding our own, and we will grow at a rapid pace and take the world along with it, and contribute significantly more to growth than we have done in the past. And that's just a recognition that this is India's moment.
So we are also good to go for the audience questions now.
I'm Sushil Vaishnav, and we are the startup we are collecting the waste cooking oil, then converting into the biofuels. And the future, it will be in the sustainable aviation fuel. So we have seen this journey. We started about 5 years back, and now we are also growing, no doubt. And we have seen how the premium restaurants are always full, and that's where we get the oil also. But during this journey, we are also observing, earlier it was easier to hire the people, but now the same people, you cannot get the people to grow your business. So is there any thoughts, any government is working on something which can help the companies like us to grow? Because at the end, if people are not there, how will grow?
I think the fact that the number of educational institutions, whether it is engineering colleges or management institutions, have come up, have expanded significantly in the last several years. So therefore, not only the available pool of graduates that the government has significantly contributed to through its expansion plans of engineering and management education institutions is a contribution that the government has made. And secondly, the government, in collaboration with the industry, is also making sure that these graduates are more employable than before, because there is a study by CII which shows that compared to about 17, 18 years ago, where only about a third of the graduates were readily employable without any additional training, now the number has gone up to 51%. So where startups have to focus on is not only to look for these kinds of students or graduates from the top tier towns, but also be able to go and look for them in tier B and tier C cities. And I think together with the private sector, and I would expect Mr. Panda also to chip in with his response to your question, it is important to make sure that the educational content and the industry requirements are aligned. That is another way through which we can make sure that the people you are looking for are indeed available from the academic campuses.
I think what's important, I mean, we certainly have the demographics in our favor, but as Dr. Nageshwaran mentioned, it's important to ensure that they have the right skills to be employable and good to go from the start. And that is where it's not just what government alone is doing through the various skill development programs, etc. But I think industry too needs to step in to be part of the curriculum when it comes to to education and other things. And also play a role in terms of encouraging vocational employment, because not everybody can be an engineer, doctor, or lawyer. And the important part is not everybody needs to be an engineer, doctor, or lawyer. There are many other areas and vocations where people can be gainfully employed and contribute. But again, I think it is important for industry, be it established industries or be it startups, to sort of be part of the ecosystem in terms of giving feedback as to what sort of skills and talents that you're looking at, so that you're able to then source people with the right talent base to be able to help you grow your business and thereby help the economy grow as well.
Next question.
My name is Sohani Khanna. I'm from Trinity Dwarka. As we all are aware that India's population currently is 1.42 billion, which is a lot, and our government is exuberantly managing it. My question is open to all, and my question is, what is the economic implications of India's demographic dividend, and how can we maximize it?
As you noticed in our deliberations a while ago, in terms of several strategies that the government has come up with, the idea is to have action led by people themselves. Government is facilitating, is in more an enabling role. Various institutions, various individuals, various initiatives are coming up. And if you pick up Economic Survey, and CA is sitting right here, year before last, there was one full chapter on startup, which demonstrated how in each district we are seeing these new initiatives coming in. That, I think, is something which is demonstrating the fact that now you have your own sky with you. You have your own trajectory in terms of initiatives. So I think it is giving the right ecosystem that is needed. And that's where, as Prime Minister very often says, that we have to have more governance and not such heavy government. And that's where I think scope for our action, scope for individuals' action, their ability to grab skills, grab resources that are available and take off. And that's where I think is the scope for each one of many of us to take that action forward.
The government is helping the realization of demographic dividend through many policies which have been discussed in the course of the last 45 minutes or so, creating infrastructure, therefore enabling manufacturing to grow, and that creates employment opportunities, recapitalizing banks, financial inclusion. All these things are ways in which you create growth for the people and for the country. But since you have lots of youngsters are sitting here, what I would like to do is to throw the ball back at you by saying that if the country is to realize the demographic dividend, there has to be an attitude of continuous learning and skills upgradation on your part. That will also be a vital component of being able to realize the demographic dividend. So I just thought I would leave that additional point with you.
As you know, the G20 has the finance track, the Sherpas track, and it also has the engagement groups. And in fact, it is an Indian contribution that we have set up a Startup 20 or the S20, again, to supplement what has been said. So putting it in this G20 context.
My question is for Mr. Ajay. So India has jumped to 46th rank in terms of global innovation index, but yet we are lacking in terms of number of patents registered by India. So we have got approximate 30,000 patents, and at the same time China has got 5.3 lakhs and USA has got 3.5 lakh. So what plan we are going to make to have more and more patents in India's name, especially when many countries allow deduction, additional deduction, weighted deduction for the research and development expenditure, but the India has withdrawn such weighted deductions. So your response, sir?
Let me attempt on this. One is the procedural part. How much time does it take from an application for patent to its acceptance? There's a very active work is happening, and if you can recall extensively, Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal has written about it in the that which are the ways to move forward, and a very definite action is happening on that ground. Second one is to working with the academic institutions, that it is a part of, it gets into part of their DNA. One of their KPIs, that how many patents they facilitate. It is not just about academic institutions, but working along with the industry, because there's a collaboration between industry and academic institutions which will bring out and facilitate more patents. And let me share with you just about the last Friday. I was sitting in one of the expenditure finance committee meetings shared by finance secretary, where one of the departments had brought in a proposal on setting centers of excellence on artificial intelligence. And in their KPIs, in the design and monitoring framework, they have said that end of 5 years, how many patents their initiative will facilitate. So this is saying that increasingly getting into a government action, academic institutions working with the industry, one is a supply side, another one is a procedural aspect. So that's what in the direction we are going. And the third element also goes in, that as an economy, how much money we spend really into the R&D. Patents will not come in through a pure research, it requires an applied research to happen in those areas. And that will be my answer to you.
May I come in for a second?
Sure, go ahead.
You asked the question from the point of view that, again, how can we incentivize R&D? But I think Mr. Seth was absolutely spot on when he said that it's important for industry academia engagement to play a role, and for the ecosystem to recognize that whether or not there is an incentive, it is in our best interest, it is in the best interest of industry to invest in money in R&D, and that is what will lead to greater patents. And from a industry academia engagement perspective, what is also important is that academic institutions work on solving problems which industry have, because there is, of course, research in its in a isolated basis, if I can put it that way, or working with industry to actually solve problems that we have. And I think there is much movement taking place in this regard, and it's important to look at it from the point of doing what is good from an industry perspective, rather than saying that unless I have incentives, I will not go into research and development.
If you look at the inflow of foreign direct investment in India and outflow, you would see a history in our case where for several years outbound foreign direct investment was higher than incoming foreign direct investment. In last few years, things have changed because entrepreneurs, industrialists, their faith in the country has multiplied, and this has given the right ecosystem that Mr. Panda is referring to. And that, I think, is important when people apply for foreign direct investment cases here, and people apply for patents in India. Now you would find many companies, many individuals applying for patents outside India. When they see that Indian market is expanding, India is bringing in the necessary ecosystem, that is to protect patents, that is to respect intellectual property, you would find much more confidence coming in. So it is about perception, it is about mechanism, but it is also about economy, size of the economy. Now that we have been discussing for last couple of minutes about the rise of Indian economy, you would find that R&D, because R&D system has been there, TIFAC and all have been working for ages, but the bandwidth of the economy was not there. Thanks to the reforms that India has seen in last few years, thanks to the faith of Indian industry in our market, in our investment, you find that ecosystem multiplying. Now you would see more and more with Chandrayaan and with others, you find the bandwidth, you find more science, technology, innovation coming in, patent number would also multiply.
Under the Indian presidency, what are the milestones, economic and other milestones that we're expecting to gain or achieve during this summit?
Well, I mean, we will have to wait for the results, but what has come out from the 15 or more ministerial meetings so far, I think it is safe to say a very rich menu of achievements is there for our presidency. I already mentioned to you with regard to the cross-cutting theme of the Global South, but I think two achievements which we have got is, and these are very unique to the Indian presidency. One is showcasing our incredible India as the mother of democracy in all its glory, variety, and diversity to the entire world. We would have had more than 220 meetings across the length and breadth of the country. We are trying to showcase our rich culture, arts, traditions, customs, even couture and cuisine. And I think that will have a collateral advantage with regard to tourism. I've already read some reports saying that after the G20 working group meeting in J&K, the foreign tourist arrivals there have gone up, for example. The second one, which has already been achieved, is I think we have succeeded in taking the G20 to all corners of the country, to all sections of society. And there I would say I've myself been part of the RIS, MEA, G20 University Connect Engaging Young Minds program. There have also been the Youth 20 programs, and so on and so forth. So this has already been achieved. As I also mentioned, that the expansion and getting on board the African Union, on which there appears to be an emerging consensus, we are not sure, of course, I think would be another major achievement of the Indian presidency. And then, of course, there are the specific priorities of the Indian presidency. Many of them on climate change, sustainable development, on the SDG goals, on the digital public infrastructure field, women empowerment and gender equality, and not to forget the reform of the multilateral institutions. So I think these will all be things which we expect to see coming out of the summit, of course, in addition to a lot more.
So that's all the time we have for this discussion. I'd like to thank our guests, Mr. Ajay Seth, Secretary, Department of Economic Affairs, Dr. Ananta Nageshwaran, Chief Economic Advisor, Mr. Shubhrakant Panda, President of FICCI, Dr. Sachin Chaturvedi, the Director General of RIS for Information Systems, and Mr. J.S. Mukul, former Ambassador of India. Thank you very much. And as has been clear from this discussion, we've been talking about growth and resilience. It is the inclusive approach that India has brought to the table that is a solution finder, really, of most of these questions that you've been talking about: inclusion, whether it's digital inclusion, inclusion of the Global South, and that has also been one of the reasons why our economy, through financial inclusion, subjects that we've discussed, has taken our economy forward and on a high growth path. We leave it there. Thank you very much for watching. Namaskar.